And you are all ready to go, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. So good afternoon. This is a meeting of the Active Transportation Advisory Committee for Halifax Regional Municipality. Thursday, April 21st. And the first thing, order of business, is to call to order and provide a land acknowledgement. With the call to order, we're going to have a roll call, and I'm asking members in turn to identify themselves and to ensure that you have audio and video on, starting with Councillor Becky Kent.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'm here. Can you all hear me? I can see and hear you, so.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Annika Ropel. Is Annika here? Not yet. Okay. Miles McCormick.
Yes, I'm here, Hugh.
Hi, Miles. How are you?
Good to see you.
Paul Berry. I believe Paul, he sent regrets to say he would be late joining the meeting, so I'm assuming he's not here yet. Next is Andrew Taylor.
I'm here.
Hello, Andrew.
Hello.
And then Milena Casanavicius.
You're getting better and better, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Elizabeth Pugh.
I'm here and I'm not driving this meeting.
Oh, okay, good.
Stationarily here.
So we can see you. Peter Zimmer.
Here, ready to go this
Hello,
time.
Peter. Okay. Alison Carlisle.
Allison has actually moved on to a new position, so she probably should be removed from the list. I don't know if BNS might, they haven't replaced her yet, but I assume that somebody else will represent BNS when appropriate.
Okay. So Alison won't be with us today.
Right.
Mohammed Ehsan. Mohammed? Okay, I don't hear from Mohammed. Douglas Wetmore is our vice chair.
Present. Thank you, Hugh.
Hello, Douglas. And myself, Hugh Millward, will be chairing the meeting. We have various staff members joining us. In particular, David McIsaac should be here. Are you here, David? Yes, you are. I see.
Yep.
Okay.
I'm here.
Hello, David. So the land acknowledgement, I'll just read this to you. The Halifax Regional Municipality is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq people. The municipality acknowledges the peace and friendship treaties signed in this territory and recognizes that we are all treaty people. So with that, we'll move on to item 2, which is approval of the minutes of March 17th, which were circulated to you. If anyone sees any errors or omissions, could you let us know now? I don't hear any. So what I need is a motion to approve the minutes as circulated. I need a mover and a seconder.
I'll make that motion.
Okay, Andrew moves and
Andrew Taylor.
yeah. And the seconder?
I can second. It's Elizabeth.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And then I'll call the question. All those in favor of approval, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
And any opposed, say nay or raise your hand. Okay, there are none opposed, so that motion carries unanimously as circulated. Item 3 is approval of the order of business and approval of any additions or deletions. Katie, have there been any late additions or deletions?
There have been no late additions or deletions.
Thank you. So again, I would, would any member of the committee wish to move one of the items in the order of business to change its order? No? then we'll, again, I need a motion to approve the order of business as it is in the agenda. I need a mover and a seconder, please.
I can move that, Hugh.
Okay, Douglas moved
Second,
and Becky seconded. Those in favor, please say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye.
And any opposed, nay, or raise your hand. No opposed, so that moves is approved unanimously. Thank you. So moving on to item 4, business arising out of the minutes. There is no business arising out of the minutes. At least I understand that to be the case. Number 5 is a call for declaration of conflict of interests. If any committee member feels they have a conflict of interest relating to anything on the agenda, now is the time to declare it. Okay, so we can move on to item 6. Item 6 is consideration of deferred business from our previous meeting, March 17th. And there is an item that was deferred at that time. It's discussion of the Active Transportation Advisory Committee's terms of reference, which was requested by Peter Zimmer. And specifically, Peter has let me know that he's particularly concerned about the place of micro mobility vehicles, motorized vehicles, in relation to active transportation infrastructure. Peter wishes to give a brief presentation. I've asked him to restrict himself to 10 minutes, and then we can have discussion. So, Peter, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much. Melania, my apologies. I don't have the text versions of this for you to follow. You'll hear my words, but you won't see the slides, and I don't have a good way to transform those. Okay. Basically, let's see. Kate, are you showing the slides for me?
Yep, they'll be up in 1 second.
Okay, thank you.
One second.
So a heads up, I think you're muted there, Peter.
Oh, Peter, you are muted. Katie,
Yep, 1 second. We're just fixing a technical difficulty.
Okay. Yep.
Okay.
can hear you now, Peter, I think. Can you say something?
Okay, I'm
We can-
unmuted, I hope.
Okay, we can hear you now.
Okay, good.
Mr. Chair, before we get going and where we have this lull, I just wanted to let you know that Councillor Hensby is watching our meeting today, watching YouTube. So I don't think he can engage, but he does like to participate. I thought that the members should know that he's interested in what we're doing today.
Nice.
Thank you. And thank you for watching the meeting, Councillor Hensby.
Okay, great. Today, I'm mostly speaking about the risk of crashes between motor vehicles and all the vulnerable road users that are apparent on the city. I think it's time to reframe the discussion of micromobility and unify where the city's focus to where it most affects people's safeties. I think it's time for the Halifax Council, its Transportation Committee, and ATAC to address this. I think our ATAC terms of reference need updating. Next slide. Okay. Okay. The 2021 report on complete streets included this diagram of a complete streets hierarchy. I'll put some scare quotes around that. In the top and largest slice are people who walk, below them people who bicycle, then those who take transit, care vehicles, and the smallest pointy bottom bit of the heap are people who drive alone. This diagram is not only hard to read, white lettering on dark purple ground, the order and categories are delusional and incomplete. They make a very poor map of the world we live in. Next slide. Micromobility is not a new option for Haligonians. In various forms, it's in use today on our streets, sidewalks, parking lots, bike lanes, multi-use pathways, and trails. Used by all sorts of people, making all sorts of trips. There are many different vehicle types for different purposes. The city has basically responded in a variety of ad hoc ways. The city commissioned research by Alta Planning and Design to report on micromobility with a focus on the possible introduction of two particular commercial forms of micromobility, e-bike shares and e-scooters shares, neither of which are currently present in our city. Meanwhile, the much more diverse set of Haligonians are actually employing micromobility in our vehicles on our public pavements and paths. Next slide. Okay, so on the left, we have the complete streets hierarchy, and I've introduced where I think the slice for micromobility really fits. The complete streets diagram and that Alta study have some major blind spots. Neither schema addresses considerations of users' trips, their destination or destinations, whether they are already using some form of micromobility, and both omit micromobility and classify into exclusive modes and says, if you mostly walk, you're never a cyclist or driving alone. But like many others around this ATAC table, depending on the planned trip, the weather, and other factors, I may walk or bike or take a bus or cab or drive a car. And I'm sometimes driving alone, sometimes with passengers. For every trip, I may have a very different concern about my own safety and about my potential participation in a collision with another public pavement user. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just an introduction to some of the many forms that micromobility and its predecessor, active transportation, actually take. We've got e-bikes and personal transporters like Segways, scooters, and skateboards. We have disability transporters for people with a mobility problem, that is, power wheelchairs and mobility scooters. Another slide, please. And here's a few more varieties. You'll notice George's Island in the background of the Segway group. Thank you, Google. We have they're a good source of images. Mostly they're battery electric powered. They're low mass with a fraction of the weight of even the smallest cars. They're small in size. They operate at low speeds, usually at a small fraction of how fast motor vehicles usually move on our streets. And perhaps most importantly, they offer vulnerable road users little or no protection from the weather or from injury or death when in collision with motor vehicles. The cost of these micromobility options are low, runs from a few $100s to, at the very high end, $25,000. And there are rentals for some of these types available here in Halifax. Next slide. This is a snapshot of some of my recent observations. The blue cells simply mark my recollection of seeing one or more micromobility vehicles. I'm sure with more observers and time, we'd fill in many of the white cells. So micromobility really is here. And this is long before we'll see any commercial bike share or e-scooter share going here in the city. Next slide. This is simply a quick listing of the characteristics of the vehicles and a listing of the vehicles by types. More of a reference point. And we'll go to the next slide. This is where I'm introducing the categories. We have vulnerable road users, okay? And they are very, very distinct from the not very vulnerable road users who are driving motor vehicles. I think these are a natural grouping and the grouping that most matters to me. And we'll scoot on to our next slide. I've got a degree in physics. I know in crashes, physics rules. Momentum matters. Talk about a bigger hammer. A cyclist masses perhaps 120 kilograms in all and moves at maybe 15 kilometers an hour. That's the little tiny blue slab at the left-hand end of your screen. A motor vehicle traveling of 1,500 kilograms, moving at only generally seen on the streets of Halifax, 60 kilometers an hour. That's a long green bar. That tiny slice, the ratio 200 to 1, this motor vehicle hits with 200 times the cyclist's impact. It's a bigger hammer by far. Next slide, please. Again, not a great slide, but it kind of tabulates 4 quadrants. We've got vulnerable road users on the left, and they are all types. I might note as a sidebar, everyone, including all the vehicle drivers, are vulnerable road users for some part of most of their trips. They walk from where they're parking their car to where they're working. They're stepping out of their car on the highway after they've parked their car by the curb. VRUs can be people of all ages, all abilities, out in all weathers, at all times of day or night. They're protected only by what they wear. VRU's mobilities range, their technologies range from flip-flops at the very lowest end up to enclosed mobility scooters. Motor vehicles. The legal motor vehicle users are all adults, or at least they're 16 years old. They're trained, they're tested, They're licensed to operate their motor vehicles by the province of Nova Scotia, and the law presumes them to be alert and in control of their vehicle. Cars, trucks, and buses are all engineered for crashworthiness. That is, they're designed to protect their occupants in a crash, but they don't particularly do a good job of protecting anyone else outside their shell. Motor vehicles, road users' vehicles are large, heavy, 1,000 kilograms and up, maximum speed over 100 kilometers an hour, motors of 100 horsepower and up. Advantage, motor vehicles if it comes to a collision, and it has too often come to a collision on our highways. Next slide, please. We had this complete streets hierarchy. It's in the white triangle in the middle, seeming to say that walking is the most important, followed by bicycling. I've inserted micromobility. Then we have shared vehicles, take buses, drive alone at the bottom. But this, I'd like you to look at where Halifax puts our money, which means I think its attention. And I think I overstate the case saying we've got a tiny little slice at the top of the cash pyramid on the right-hand side devoted to those vulnerable road users. At the bottom there, we've got all the motor vehicle users, how much they get, a much, much larger slice of the pie. And then I'll just have a couple slightly ranting slides to come. Next slide, please. I'm saying we need to start the improvements where our less privileged and most vulnerable citizens live, walk, bike. It means let's not start in the deep south end to make bike lanes better and best down there. Let's take a look where there are people who can't afford cars, who need to use buses and walk and bike and maybe e-bike. Those are affordable. Next slide. I'd assert there are no accidents. There are badly designed roads. We must change our city to end crashes which kill and maim. A couple books that I've read recently that speak to this and are very, very good. One is, the title is There Are No Accidents, written by Jesse Singer. The second one is about how they do traffic in the Netherlands. The title is Curbing Traffic, written by Melissa Bruntlett and Chris Bruntlett. They're both recent books. They're dynamite. I highly recommend them. And we go to one more slide. I'd assert AAA bike paths are not enough. We need to change and operate and maintain the streets for vulnerable road users' safety. Doing that will make them safer for the motor vehicle road users too. And as a little small side benefit, I'd say those streets, our patterns of use of our cars will be much more climate friendly. We'll be living in a greener, safer, more pleasant city. Last slide. Thank you very much for your attention. I do hope we can come to some conclusion about changing those terms of reference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. And certainly you've provided us with some food for thought. I did ask David McIsaac if he would perhaps respond first to your presentation. Are you willing to do that, David? Because I'm interested to know how the staff are dealing with these issues and yeah, how they're currently dealing with the issues. So David, are you willing to speak on this?
Sure. Just a sec here. I'm trying to get my video there.
Oh.
Not that you need to see me.
Okay.
So what do you, I mean, there's a lot there. So are you like specifically on shared micromobility or changing the terms of reference? How can I focus my comments?
Right now, the terms of reference state specifically that the Active Transportation Advisory Committee is dealing with human-powered transit. Okay, it's either walking, running, jogging, whatever you can do on your feet, or being on a bicycle, or presumably extended to tricycles, but their whole motive power has to be from human-powered. That's in the written description. And as a longtime cyclist and still a sometime cyclist, I've got a bike that I can switch on accessory power. So I'm, you know, micromobility, that's micromobility within the terms of reference, but it's the same vehicle. I'm the same rider, same person. You know, and as I say, I do observe that the micromobility users are making use of public streets, using sidewalks, using crosswalks, and using bike lanes. You know, they're saying, oh, we fit in those spaces. We'd like that little smidgen of extra protection that the painted bike lanes might give us. But we want to be free, and they are free. You know, I don't know that anybody's given tickets out to anybody who's riding in a mobility scooter, you know, for going on the sidewalks or going in the streets. And frankly, I think I'd like to see the ATAC become a forum for trying to develop a culture that is at once more inclusive and more civil than some of the conversations, you know, to be saying to the micromobility users, yeah, okay, because you've got a scooter that can go 18 kilometers an hour, you can't use it on the sidewalk as freely as you would in the street. You know.
I'm just wondering if I can butt in here, because I think the issue is how should micromobility vehicles fit into the infrastructure that is being developed currently for active transport? And I wonder, David, could you just inform us how staff currently see this?
Sure. So on the issue of, you know, shared micromobility and e-scooters, essentially what staff have been doing is gathering information. We did the shared micromobility readiness study, and I think there's at least one, maybe two presentations at this committee about that. And we've been waiting for legislation from the province as sort of a foundation to then help us kind of go forward. So, you know, we couldn't get into any kind of regulating or licensing e-scooter share providers in the city, or we couldn't establish any bylaws about where these devices could be used because they weren't legal in the province. So now with this new legislation, that's sort of our marker that we can now kind of proceed and develop some direction in HRM about these. So, and I think it's going to be kind of in two lines of policy development probably. One is going to be around making decisions about where e-scooters and I guess other shared micromobility devices can travel in the municipality. So right now, the proposed provincial legislation kind of has some default locations. And I suspect that we will be doing some research, probably coming to this committee and then going to council and asking for direction, if we're going to differ from that provincial guideline. So, multi-use pathways, for example, should they be in parks on multi-use pathways? I guess that's sort of a question that we're going to look into. Should they be on sidewalks? So right now, as I understand it, the provincial legislation prohibits it. So that, if there's the desire to change that, and that'll be council's decision at the very end of the day, that'll get discussed. So on the one hand, we're going to be talking probably about, if there's going to be differences in Halifax from the provincial legislation where they're used. On the other hand, in the other kind of form, we're also going to be going to council with some options on whether we will have e-scooter share services in the city and like what they'll look like. So there's all kinds of examples across the country. Some cities, jurisdictions just say no, we're not letting those services in. Others are, Kelowna let in they must have had like 5 or 6 e-scooter share companies operating at the same time. That was a little bit too much. So we have some ideas what we think is kind of appropriate and would be a good kind of pilot approach to help in Halifax. So, I can guarantee, I'm pretty sure that council will be getting some options but that's kind of the next phase. And so more to come on all that. Does that help you kind of situate it a bit where it is right now?
Yes, thank you. And I'm wondering.
Just one other thing. So you'll note we have had an e-scooter share operator in Halifax for the past couple of years, and they've been operating in a gray area, and it's been difficult to do enforcement. It's been difficult to kind of do anything with that just because it's been a bit of a gray area. So we're happy with that provincial legislation. I think it gives us kind of enough room to get started, and it's sort of the foundation, I think, on how we're going to build this here in the municipality.
Thank you, David. We have a full agenda tonight, or this afternoon. So I would like people to have a chance to offer their opinions as to how micromobility devices should fit into the active transport infrastructure. And I'm going to just call on a speaking list here. And if people have a question or concern or an opinion, please offer it now. So we'll start with Councillor Kent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Peter, for bringing this to the table for a conversation. I'm sort of, I've got lots of things to offer here, so I'll try to get through each one. So I absolutely agree on the perspective that we need to create and give this more attention. The people are using micromobility equipment in our communities, on our roads, on our sidewalks, in multitude of ways. But we don't have the policy that supports it, and for reasons such as that David has mentioned. And those are all things we need to work our way through. So I'm actually pleasantly surprised, and I don't know if I've missed it because I missed a meeting or if some of those presentations were before I came to the committee. But I would be open to bringing that to the Transportation Standing Committee to maybe get a briefing note, or I'll have conversations with David outside of this, because I think that's where this kind of information needs to be discussed. We as a team here, I think we would be premature to change our terms of reference until the municipality and council and the Transportation Standing Committee have the policies and the legislative authority to create strategic approach to these, to this. And I would encourage us not to change terms of reference at this stage, should that be something that we can entertain. But I think it's kind of putting the cart before the horse a little bit. The conversation is good. And I really do think that, and in relation to, I'm not sure where you're going with the notion of a forum for this. We have to be mindful of our role here. The forum would be the Transportation Standing Committee. Those are where members of the public come and have their opportunity to talk about the things, the issues like this and situations like this and movements like this. So I would encourage us to make sure that we stay in our lane, but I'm open to the notion that we need to be looking at this, and I'm grateful that and I'm going to plan to have a more conversation with David on it. I'm glad that you brought it forward.
Thank you, Councillor. Annika Ropel, do you have comments or opinions? Annika? Did we decide Annika wasn't joining us? Okay. Miles McCormick.
Yes, thank you, Peter, for bringing this forward. And Councillor Kent, I agree with what you said. The basis of the provincial government's documentation and foundation is something that would be great for the committee, for council to see, for staff to see. Eventually, we would see it. And then flowing from there with policy and procedure, then we're able to make decisions for this committee so that we're able to reflect our bylaws. So I agree. Again, Peter, thanks for bringing it forward because it's something that's there. And I feel comfortable with the foundation point from the province that it'll allow the policies and procedures to evolve. That'll make our way to us too.
Okay, thank you, Miles. Did Paul Berry join the meeting?
Yes, I did. I don't have any comments this time. Thanks, Hugh.
Okay, Paul, thank you. Andrew Taylor?
No comments.
No? Okay, thank you. Milena Kasnavicius?
Yes, I have a comment. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Peter, I too am glad that you brought this up because it puts the light on for everyone to start thinking what will happen once the provincial legislation has been passed through. I'm not quite certain how Mr. Ristelli and his segways and e-scooters have been slipping through. I can assure you, as a person who's blind and numerous of my other colleagues, I last fall tripped on an e-scooter dropped in the middle of a sidewalk right here in my District 8. And on Agricola Street, there are more and more frequent e-scooter users, some of them behaving appropriately, but they're on that sidewalk, which Agricola, as we all know, has quite narrow sidewalks to be navigating as a single person, let alone with a guide dog or with anything else or a baby stroller. So I'm glad this has been brought up, and you'll be hearing from me once this comes here for advice and once it's going to City Council. And Councillor Kent, thank you. Good luck, and I'll sign whatever you need to sign too. End of thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Milena. Elizabeth Pugh.
Yes, thanks, Hugh. I just wanted to, I guess, add that both David and I worked on the legislation that has recently come through, and we tried to do it in a way that it was a combined effort between the municipality and the province. We tried to do it in a way that gave municipalities as much flexibility as possible, because it could be that HRM wants to run things very differently than Chester or something like that. So I think it's quite a good piece of legislation. And I also, I guess, put another little plug in that I know David and I are both involved in some national committees that hear about this all the time. And it's quite interesting because there's been a lot of different things tried in a lot of different cities, and people are learning lessons constantly. So I think the fact that we're not on the leading edge of this means we've got some great lessons to learn from. And I'd be looking forward to see what HRM comes out with underneath this as a policy. But it's great that it's been brought up, but it's certainly not something that's been it's been front of mind, I guess, for those of us who are kind of in the business and watching it evolve within the city and seeing some of these frustrations, but the inability of anybody to enforce it because of the legislation not being in place. So I think you'll see some huge strides in the next little while.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Alison Carlisle. Alison?
Remember,
Mr.
she's
Chair,
not-
I think we
she's not here.
decided that she wouldn't be here.
Oh, is it Alison who's not here? Okay. Mohammed Ehsan. And Mohammed isn't here either, correct? Okay. Douglas Wetmore.
Thank you, Hugh. I've got a lot of comments and thoughts about this. Thank you for bringing this forward, Peter. I've been very excited for this presentation. On the topic of kind of what the policy will look like when it comes to micromobility, I think I'm going to have to agree with Becky Kent that there's not really much we can talk about until everything else gets finalized at the higher level and we kind of see where it goes from there. Going back to the idea of kind of remodeling what the Active Transportation Advisory Committee is all about. There was one comment in your presentation that really stood out to me, and it was something I was thinking about leading up to this, was the idea of vulnerable road users and how everyone at some point is a vulnerable road user. So for example, someone using their car to drive somewhere, eventually they're going to have to park and then use the facilities that we're discussing here, whether that be walking across the street, walking across the parking lot. As someone who takes transit to get everywhere in their day-to-day life, I have a lot of sympathy for people just waiting for the bus, and I feel like there's a lot of carryover based on the decisions we implement here when it comes to not necessarily riding the bus and the route designs themselves, but especially the facilities where it comes to walking across the street to your stop, waiting at a certain designated stop. Or I feel like there's a lot to be talked about in shifting the focus of this committee towards really addressing more of the vulnerable road users, because I feel like one of the points you were trying to make was there was a lot of carryover between what we talk about here and a handful of groups outside of just those that are using active mobility. So once we get to that point where we can have that discussion about what should this advisory committee include, I'll have plenty more thoughts and comments to make then, but I'll leave it there for now until we can hear more from Hira. Thank you again for bringing this up too.
Thank you, Douglas. I'm on the speaking list too, and I certainly have some opinions as well. But as I think you've just suggested, Douglas, it's a little bit premature to get into any sort of details or the nuts and bolts. But I will just point out that bicycles officially, legally, are not allowed on sidewalks except for young people. And therefore, and bicycles, by the way, cyclists have to wear a helmet and have to abide by the rules of the road. And I think in that sense, these micromobility devices should be treated like cyclists. So if there's one rule for cyclists, there should be a similar rule for the micromobility devices. I'll just throw that in there. Certainly, I sympathize with Milena. I agree with Milena that things like segways or some of the more high-powered electric scooters are dangerous. They're very dangerous on sidewalks, but they would also be dangerous, for example, on multi-use trails, in my opinion. Anyway, I'll leave it there. I think the consensus is this is an important topic, and it almost certainly will come back to this committee at some point. So I think we should move on with the agenda. Thank you again, Peter, for your presentation. So moving on, we have Reports, oh, well, yes, reports. Oh, sorry. Correspondence, petitions and delegations is item 7. Katie, has there been any correspondence to the committee?
There's been no correspondence to the committee.
Thank you. And petitions, have there been any petitions, or do any committee members have petitions that they wish to bring to the committee?
There are no petitions from the clerk's office at this time.
Thank you, Katie. Then we'll move on to item 7.3, which is presentations. And again, there are no presentations other than the one we've heard from Peter, which brings us to item 8, reports, discussion and updates. And in particular, we have a number of reports from staff, starting with staff update on projects and plans from David McIsaac. So David.
Thanks, Hugh. I'm going to keep this more brief than usual, because there's 3 presentations coming after me that I think are more significant. One thing that I was going to talk a bit about today, but what I might do is try to get a bigger chunk of the agenda next time and just talk about the HRM budget that was passed last week. I always think it's helpful just to take the committee through the projects and the budgets for active transportation. So let's put a marker down for that. Want to let the community or the committee know that we'll be doing some public engagement in Lucasville on April the 30th at the Wallace Lucas Community Center, 596 Lucasville Road. And so that's going to focus on our project there to put a multi-use pathway on Lucasville Road. And we're going to have like 2 or 3 or 4 more sets of public engagements before the end of June that are just kind of fitting into place now. So I'll communicate those to the committee either at the next meeting or maybe even before as they firm up. I had e-scooter legislation on my list, but that's more or less been covered. I will mention, Hugh, just based on your last comment about that the e-scooters should be, treated similar to bicycles. That was one of the more guiding sort of principles or thoughts that we had, as the province and HRM were kind of working on this. So you'll see that in terms of, helmet legislation, the fact that e-scooters are not permitted on sidewalks. They are allowed in bike lanes. So and even the default sort of definition of them, if you look at the legislations, they are to be sort of treated like bicycles. So that's been positive. I'm going to leave it at that. There's a lot to talk about. I'm happy to take any questions on anything specific or if there's any burning issues, but I'd like to give the time to 3 presenters.
Okay, thank you, David. As you say, we have several staff reports to follow, so I will expect to hear from more from you in our next meeting, no doubt. But right now, I rather than go through the speaking list, I'll simply ask if anyone has any specific questions for David right now. Okay, I don't hear any. So thank you, David. We'll move on to item 8.1.2, which is a staff presentation on the Regional Centre AAA Pocket Bike Map with Siobhan Witherby. Is Siobhan with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for having us this evening at ATAC. My name is Siobhan Witherby. I'm an active transportation planner with HRM. I'm joined by my colleague, Chloe Kennedy, who's also an AT planner working on the project. We're excited to share with you a project that we've recently initiated with Upland. There are some slides. Katie, are you able to cast those, or would you like me to share my screen? Oh, you've got it. Perfect. So yeah, we just wanted to introduce a new project that we've initiated. It is a regional center pocket-sized bike map to focus on bicycle commuting within the core of Halifax. Our old bike map pamphlet is quite large, and if you are kind of opening it up to look at the detail in the urban center, you have to open the map all the way, and it's a little bit unwieldy. So we're looking for a more portable pocket solution. That's an opportunity to kind of look at our routes again, revise it based on the IMP objectives of multi-mobility, and yeah, just be able to distribute it within the regional center and hopefully lead to some more active commuting. So I'm going to hand over the presentation to our consultants at Upland. So we have Juniper Littlefield and Ryan McLean here who will take you through the presentation slides, and we welcome your discussion on this.
Yeah, thanks, Siobhan. So I'm also joined by my colleague, Ryan McLean, who's here. She's going to take some notes for me. But I'll just walk you through sort of an introduction to the project and show you some examples of other bike maps we've been looking at. And then I'll open it up for discussion. But if anyone has questions as I'm going, feel free to interrupt me. Yeah, next slide. Thanks. So Siobhan already gave a bit of an introduction, but as she said, we're working on this bike map, which will be a portable sort of pocket-sized version showing the regional center. So that's the Halifax Peninsula and downtown Dartmouth, essentially. And we'd like it to direct readers to all ages and mobilities, or all ages and abilities cycling facilities within the regional center, as well as multimodal connections to transit and other types of transportation, to amenities that would be useful for cyclists, as well as key destinations. And then it'll also include, in addition to the map, some information related to safety and other cycling resources. Next slide, please. This is just a brief timeline of the project. We started it up last month in March. So we began with some data collection, as well as getting in sort of right away into launching engagement on the project. So we have an interactive map that's online now, and I'll show you that in a minute. But so far we posted a few focus groups. We had one with internal HRM staff, as well as an external stakeholder group made up of cycling advocates within Halifax and Nova Scotia. And then next week, we've got a presentation to the Accessibility Advisory Committee planned as well. So following all of that, we'll be wrapping it up with an engagement summary report. So that'll be shared to give everyone an idea of what we've been hearing and what we'll be sort of taking into consideration as we design the bike map. So the draft version of the bike map will be available next month in May, and we'll be doing a bit of engagement on that before we finalize everything. So we're hoping to have the bike map prepared sort of early summer so we can get it out to everyone that's going to be on their bikes this summer. So it's a pretty quick timeline. Next slide, please. So just a bit of context for the project. I'll keep it brief, but these are some of the key strategies from HRM that we've been referencing for this project. So we've considered the active transportation priorities plan, as well as the integrated mobility plan. You can see a snapshot of that down below. And then also the Halifax accessibility strategy, which was recently completed last year. So those have formed some of the sort of foundation for this project. Next slide. So I'm just going to take you through a few examples. The first couple are from Halifax, so a lot of you are probably already familiar with these. This is a screenshot from the Halifax online bike map. So it shows the existing bicycle infrastructure. This is sort of a zoomed in version. So this is a little further than the extent that we're focusing on, but it shows, like I said, the bicycle infrastructure by route type. So there's multi-use pathway, protected bike lane, painted bike lane, local street bikeway, as well as paved shoulders. And then it also has some suggested routes. So these are roads where there's not dedicated cycling infrastructure, but where they're sort of more comfortable for cyclists, and those are recommended routes. And then we also have a few different amenities on this map. So you can see at this extent, there's public washrooms. And when you zoom in, it'll also show you bicycle repair stations as well. Next slide. And then here is the regional paper bike map that Siobhan was holding up a moment ago. So it's pretty similar to the online version. You have all of the different facility types shown in various colors. It also displays amenities like washrooms. There's Halifax transit terminals are provided, as well as bike lockers. And then we have some destinations like recreation facilities, public libraries. It's showing commercial districts as well as university campuses. And then there's a bit of additional information on this one. So it has areas where cyclists should use caution, areas where bicycles are not permitted, some steeper slopes, as well as one-way streets. So there's a bit more detail on this one, and it shows the full extent of the municipality. Next slide. And I have a couple examples from elsewhere. So these are both examples of paper bike maps that fold down to be a similar size to what we're aiming for. So this one's from Salt Lake City. And there's sort of a similar level of detail to the municipal version I was just showing, but the main difference with this one is that they've displayed their bicycle routes by comfort level rather than by facility type. So they've got in green the higher comfort routes, and those are trails and roads are sort of separated so you can see the two. Then they've got medium comfort, low comfort, very low comfort, and they've also shown a couple other route types. So there's helpful sidewalks where there's sort of a gap in between bicycle facilities. They've also displayed some trails as well as commuter rail. Next slide. And then on the left here, they break it down. So they've actually sort of defined how they've assigned these different comfort levels. So the high comfort level are off-road trails, on-road lanes where there's physical separation from traffic. So similar to those new bike lanes we've been installing, like the one on South Park Street. It also has some streets where there's maybe not dedicated bicycle infrastructure, but it's lower vehicle speeds and lower traffic volumes. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there's the extremely low comfort level, which is routes that are not recommended for bicycle travel, but there might not be an alternative route for some key trips. So those would be places where there's probably no dedicated facilities and there's maybe high speeds and high traffic volumes. And then on the right, they've also included some insets with different sort of essential cycling information. They have a little piece on what to do if you're involved in a collision or if you experience another emergency. They have links to some bicycle resources as well as the municipal website and different information that might come in handy. And then this is just a snippet of it, so there is more involved, but I wanted to pull out some of the interesting ones. So the last piece here is showing you different accessories for your bike, where you can use a bell and where lights are required by law. It also has a simple breakdown of how to maintain your bike or check your brakes and that sort of thing. Next slide, please. And the last example is from New York City. So obviously it's a big area and there's a lot of detail on this one. Something I like about this one is that they've shown the distance, they have a little scale that shows miles and kilometers as well as minutes. So you can sort of estimate your route based on whichever measurement is easier for you. They've also shown their legend. They have little photos of each route type. So they have protected bike lanes, conventional bike lanes, which would just be the painted ones, as well as shared lanes where you have to ride with traffic. And then they have signed bicycle routes. And there's also a lot going on the map itself. So they have labels inset into the map where there's more information needed. Like they've got hours for the bridge, and information where there's sort of entrances to bike paths and that type of thing. And then there's also a little bit of information on the bike share program that there is in the city. Next slide. So this is just one example I pulled from the insets they've included on this bike map. So this one shows how to navigate different intersection types, and they've just included graphics of sort of particularly challenging intersections that might be difficult for less experienced cyclists. So they've got a little diagram showing what to do in each case, and then they've broken it down in text on the right-hand side in 3 different languages. So it's got sort of very straightforward do's and don'ts for each intersection type. And next slide. So that's the end of the examples. I just wanted to take a second to sort of plug our interactive map. So if all of you have access to these slides, there's a link in here. And if you don't have it, we can certainly send that around, but I won't go into it right now, but it's quite simple to use. There's some little instructions when you open the map. And as you can see in this image here, it just shows you the regional center. So this highlighted area is our sort of the extent of our map that we're creating. And it shows the existing bicycle facilities in Halifax and allows you to just sort of drag a pin onto the map and make comments. So there's different categories. If you want to suggest a route that you like to use, you can draw that on the map, and you can also make a note if there's certain destinations or amenities you'd like to see included on our map. So that's going to be open at least for another week. So you have some time to make comments on that if you're interested. And next slide.
And just Juniper, I have placed the link to the social pinpoint in the chat for anyone who's interested.
Great, thank you for doing that, Ryan. Yeah, so feel free to click on that link. We'll be taking comments, and a lot of that information will be going directly into our map design. So that's a really helpful tool for us. And then we have a few discussion questions. I think rather than doing each one at a time, I'll just walk you through them. And then if anyone has comments, we can open it up at the end. So there's sort of 3 main categories that we're looking for feedback on. And the first is on map design. So the main things we're looking to find out is really what needs to be shown on the map. So what level of detail will be the most useful. There's another bike map example here from Austin at the bottom of the page. So you can sort of see from the different examples, there's a wide range in the level of detail that's included in each. And we want to really find a good balance where there's all of the information that you need for your bike trip without making it overwhelming and hard to use. So that's what we are hoping to find out from all of you. And one other thing we've been looking at is where planned bicycle facilities can fit into this. So there's some facilities, for example, that are planned to be constructed this summer. So it might be useful to include those given our release date, while there's others that are sort of still in design phase. And we're hoping to strike the right balance of what we include in this map. Another piece in terms of map design is how we classify the routes. So I showed a couple examples earlier of routes classified by facility type as well as by comfort level. And there can also be some sort of combination in between. There might even be other options if anyone has any ideas. And then the next slide, we'll look at educational information. So Here's another example from New York City where they show different bicycle laws in the city, and as well as some sort of basic etiquette. And we here are just looking to find out really what people need to know if they're either new to cycling or new to Halifax. So where are there gaps in that education piece that we could help fill? And next slide, please. And then the last piece is on the format of the map. So as I mentioned, we're hoping to make this one will be a smaller version than the current regional bike map. We want to make it convenient while also being legible. So there's a variety of size options for this. Some of them are as small as the size of a credit card. Some are made to fit in your pocket. And then we'll have like the typical brochure size that you're probably used to seeing with maps. And another, sort of question around this is how it'll be distinguished from the online and regional maps that Halifax currently has. Next slide, please. Yeah, so before we get into discussion, I'll just walk you through the next steps for the project. As I said, that interactive map, which is hosted through a website called Social Pinpoint, will be open for the next week. If anyone wants to add comments to that, you can also reach out to myself or Siobhan directly if you'd rather send an email or call us. And we have a workshop next week with the Accessibility Advisory Committee. So that'll be our last piece of engagement before we release that What We Heard report and start working on the map. And then there will be additional opportunities to comment once that draft pocket bike map is completed next month. And next slide, I think this is the last one. Yeah. So this is our contact info. My email is juniper@uplandstudio.ca. And then there's withers@halifax.ca if you want to reach out to Siobhan. So feel free to contact us after or later on, but I'll open the floor now to you if there's any comments or questions for us. So yeah. Thanks for your time.
I may quickly jump in. I showed the full-size pamphlet at the beginning, and I meant to show sort of our inspiration for these other smaller pocket-sized documents that Juniper was referring to. So this is Salt Lake City's bike map, which is more of a pocket style, and this is a Vancouver transit map, which is actually folds down to the size of a credit card. So yeah, just kind of some visuals of how small we're thinking it might be. So you can jump in with your question responses or.
Okay, thank you, Juniper and Siobhan. I do have a speaking list here, and I'm sure people will have comments. So I'll just take you through the speaking list. I'll call on Elizabeth Pugh first.
Thanks, Hugh. I have no questions, but looks like a great project. Looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Peter Zimmer.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you're presuming, as many software developers do when they're developing a website, having beta testers, actually printing your beta version of your map, distributing it to active cyclists, and then polling them or interviewing them for comments after they've had the map in their pocket and they've used it for a couple of months. You know, that seems to me to check out the work you've done is, you know, if you get back comments of saying, well, in 3 weeks, it started to fall apart in my pocket, that tells you something about this before you launch into, you know, printing 10,000 of them and distributing them in various channels. I mean, check out that what you're doing actually ends up viewed by the cyclists you've distributed to as being useful. And maybe they will come across suggestions for improvements after they've tried to use the map that you won't get while you're reviewing nice images on screen.
Okay, thank you for the suggestion, Peter. Douglas Wetmore.
Nothing else to add from me. Thank you, Hugh.
Okay, Douglas. Councillor Kent.
Oh, nothing for me other than great job, everyone. It's pretty cool what you've done. I like it.
Okay. Miles McCormick.
No more further questions, but thanks for a job well done.
Okay. And Paul Berry.
Nothing to input, but sounds like a really great project. Looking forward to seeing the end result.
Okay. Andrew Taylor.
I am the chair of the Accessibility Advisory Committee that you're presenting to in the near future. So I'm going to keep my questions for that committee because it might be a little more relevant to that committee as opposed to this one.
Okay, that sounds good, Andrew. Milena Kasanavicius.
Oh, Mr. Chair, I'm not vicious, not yet. Yes, I've got a comment and two quick questions. This sounds exciting. As a person who's completely blind, just to confirm, this is going to be a paper map and then something that's online as well?
Siobhan, do you want to respond to that, or?
Hi, Milena. Yes, we're definitely starting with the paper map version. We have the online version that exists right now that looks at the entire municipality, where it is kind of interactive and you can zoom into the regional center. It will have some of the same capabilities, but our plan is to kind of update that online bike map to reflect some of these changes that we've done in the regional center and make sure that that information is still available to people. Whether or not that's in the same online map or in a separate sort of online map is still to be determined, but we do intend to have sort of online component with the updates as resulting from this process.
Okay, always good to hear you, Siobhan, too. And my second question is on the online versions, and I'll give an example of the campground up. What is it? Bloomingdale, just a little past Wolfville. So they have the hiking trails, but there's also some description. And even though I'm completely blind, I do have a tandem bike, and I'd like to have a little bit more control. I know this is not that urgent, but if I was to go online, right now, a lot of the bike routes are not accessible in any shape or form to me. So somewhere in the near future to put this under, your biking helmets, just to write out a trail. It doesn't have to be detail for detail, but let's say it starts at South Park and heads east, north, whatever the case may be. So people such as myself who have tandems, when I can harass my pilots to go biking with me, perhaps I can choose a route and bring that forth to my pilot rather than having that decision made for me. That would be great in the near future. Other than that, sounds excellent.
No, that's a really cool idea. And I believe with the bike map right now, you can click a pop-up and get a small amount of information, but it's more of like attribute style rather than a nice written description. But I see how that could be useful. And yeah, we can take that into consideration when we're making the updates to the online map.
Yeah, especially I think I heard Juniper say that in the New York map, if I recall correctly, that there was a text version and 3 different languages. And I would focus more, let's say my pilot and I don't know, went off the road, and so that I had read in a format that can read emergency and how to perhaps fix my bike, or I don't know, untangle my pilot from the wheel. I'm smiling. So that would be great. And end of thought. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Milena. I think that leaves me with a question or two. I gathered from what you were saying that you're considering only looking at the regional center as it's defined in the regional plan, which is Peninsula Halifax and Dartmouth inside the circumferential. I would prefer it if you extended things a little bit further out, because there are quite a few bike routes in the built up portion of Dartmouth, certainly perhaps as far as Cole Harbour, and similarly up through to Clayton Park and parts of the mainland on the Halifax side. And that was one thing that occurred to me. And the other one was the Salt Lake City map where they used comfort levels. And it seemed as though you're thinking of using that sort of system. But I think it's the wrong word, because really what's important and what they really mean is safety levels. Comfort is a sort of squishy word which could refer to the grade, for example. But safety, it's clear what that means. So those are just a couple of thoughts that you might take into consideration. Does anyone have any final comments before we move on?
No.
Okay, hearing none. Thank you very much again for the presentation. And we'll move on to staff presentation 8.1.3, Lower Water Street Redevelopment Project. And is it Lean Romane?
Yeah, you pronounced it perfectly.
Okay, fine. Please go ahead.
Awesome.
All right,
I'm
thank
just
you.
going to promote Lean to a co-host here so she can present. And you should be good to share your screen.
All right, just give me 1 second in that case. Do you see it okay?
Yeah.
All right, awesome. So good afternoon. My name is Lean Romane. I'm a transportation planner, and I'm also the project manager for the Water Street Functional Plan, which I'm here today to present on. In today's presentation, I will give an overview of the project's background and existing conditions. Then I'll go over the design options that are being considered for Water Street, followed by an overview of the proposed streetscaping enhancements, and then update on the project schedule. And then at the end, I'd be happy to answer any question that you might have on the project. HRM is completing a functional design project for Water Street that will inform changes to the corridor. The study area for this project includes Lower and Upper Water Street from Terminal Road at the southern end of the corridor to historic properties at the northern end. The goal of this project is to provide a corridor-wide vision for Water Street that is based on its current and future needs, and based on policy direction from the various land use and transportation plans, so like the Integrated Mobility Plan and the Active Transportation Priorities Plan. This project will help us to identify potential design options for the corridor that attempt to improve the quality of transportation infrastructure for all users. This project will also help us understand the potential implications of the different design options on the street functionality, so things like transit operations or on-street parking, and impacts to the right-of-way, private properties, and utilities, among many others. Water Street is an important corridor for walking, rolling, and cycling. It sees considerable pedestrian activity from tourists exploring downtown Halifax to commuters accessing the harbor ferries, and downtown residents and workers going about their daily activities. The street experiences its highest pedestrian volumes during the summer season, reaching about 5,000 pedestrians per day and over 100,000 pedestrians in a month. The majority of the corridor has sidewalks with acceptable widths, but there are critical pinch points at Prince Street and at historic properties where sidewalks are reduced below acceptable widths or are discontinued entirely. The image on the left shows the pinch point at Prince Street. So the limited right-of-way between the existing buildings has contributed to a very narrow sidewalk on the west side of the street. The narrow sidewalk is also made worse by the streetlight standard obstructing the sidewalk, which further reduces the amount of clear sidewalk space to less than a meter, making the sidewalk inaccessible. The image on the right shows the pinch point at historic properties. So closely spaced buildings has resulted in a constrained right-of-way, and inadequate pedestrian facilities. The sidewalk on the east side of the street, so by historic properties, is narrow and further constrained by metal bollards. And then the sidewalk on the west side of the street is discontinued just before the Cogswell interchange, again, due to inadequate widths. The sidewalk also along the corridor also has a varied streetscape, including up to 11 different combinations of surface treatments. And in addition to a dated look and feel, the various surface materials and treatments have created a disjointed experience that can be difficult to navigate for those with, for people with visual and mobility difficulties. Water Street is also a key link in HRM's bicycle network. It provides a northbound connection for cyclists that pairs with the southbound cycling connection of Hollow Street. Water Street is part of an envisioned all ages and abilities bikeway network for downtown Halifax. This vision includes protected bikeways on Water Street, Hollow Street, Terminal Road, George Street, and Morris Street. In 2020, a tactical bikeway was installed on Water Street between Terminal Road and Prince Street and between George Street and historic properties. A protected bikeway was also installed in 2020 as part of the street reinstatement in front of the Queen's Mark development. In addition to Water Street being an important active transportation corridor, it is also designated as a transit priority corridor in the Integrated Mobility Plan. Right now, only 3 transit routes run on Water Street, but as part of Transit's Moving Forward Together plan, more routes are planned to run along the corridor in the near future, increasing transit service from 3 routes today to about 13 routes. The 10 additional routes will be the express routes and will only service Water Street during the afternoon peak period. The addition of these routes will increase the number of buses traveling along the corridor from 10 buses an hour during the PM peak period or the afternoon peak period to about 37 buses an hour, which is an increase of about 27 buses. And given the planned growth in transit service along the corridor, and given that traffic congestion impacts transit reliability and travel time, Water Street was designated as a transit priority corridor. Because of that, opportunities to provide priority to buses over general traffic through the use of transit priority measures like dedicated bus lanes have been considered as part of this project. Over the next few slides, I'll go over our design objectives and the design options that are under consideration. Our project team recognized that Water Street is an important corridor in downtown Halifax, and following a detailed review of existing conditions, we identified a need for key improvements that will enhance how people use the corridor to move within and through the area. So using a complete streets approach and based on policy direction, we established some key design objectives. These design objectives include enhancing the pedestrian realm and public spaces by improving the connectivity, functionality, and the quality of the pedestrian infrastructure, recognizing Water Street's historical character and importance from the perspective of being a hub for tourism and civic events. As part of this project, we are also exploring opportunities to improve the street's aesthetics by making streetscaping improvements. So, for example, adding more trees, or street furniture like benches. The second design objective is to develop a continuous all ages and abilities bicycle facility that provides dedicated space for cyclists and includes features that improve safety, comfort, and convenience. And then the third design objective is to implement transit priority measures. So again, things like dedicated bus lanes that would allow buses to operate more efficiently, particularly during the peak traffic periods. The fourth and last design objective is continuing to accommodate vehicular traffic, including heavy and oversized loads. Using these design objectives, we developed 2 functional design options for Water Street. Option 1 is the transit-focused option, which prioritizes improvements to transit along the corridor. Option 2 is the pedestrian enhanced option, which prioritizes improvements to the pedestrian realm. I'll give an overview of the design elements included in each of these options over the next few slides. These design elements that I'll talk about are applicable to the majority of the corridor, with the exception of the pinch points I mentioned earlier, so at Prince Street and at historic properties. Because of the right-of-way constraints at those two pinch points, there's really only one possible design solution, and that's to widen the narrow sections of the sidewalk, connect any missing sections, and remove any obstructions that may be impacting pedestrian movements. The design options will also not apply to the segment between George Street and Duke Street. So that is where the Water Street Transit Terminal is located today. So the first functional design option I'll go over is option 1, the transit-focused option. Again, this option prioritizes improvements to transit along the corridor. This slide shows a typical cross-section for the transit-focused option, and I'll describe the diagram from left to right or west to east. So for the off-street elements on the west side of the street, this option would include a wide sidewalk and a buffer separating the sidewalk from the roadway. This buffer provides opportunities to add streetscaping elements like trees, lighting, and benches. For the on-street elements, this option would provide a 2-lane cross-section that includes a mixed traffic lane on the west side of the street and a peak period, and a peak period bus lane on the east side of the street. The bus lane would accommodate on-street parking and loading during the off-peak periods only. So in other words, on-street parking and loading activities would not be permitted during the commuter peak periods when the bus lane is operational. So as an example, that could be between 3 to 6 p.m. And then for the off-street elements on the east side of the street, so that's the waterfront side, this option would accommodate a buffer separating the bicycle lane from the street. It would also include a raised bicycle lane, a raised unidirectional bicycle lane, similar to what is currently in front of the Queen's Mark development at George Street. This option would also accommodate a sidewalk buffer. This buffer would provide opportunities to add streetscaping elements. And finally, this option would also include a wide sidewalk. So I'm just going to pause here very quickly and maybe show you a video that our project team developed that shows a graphical illustration of what the two design options could look like. So this video would show the what the transit focus option could look like on Water Street, just north of Morris Street. So in this video, you can see that 2-lane cross section on the corridor right here. Again, one of them would be a mixed traffic lane. The other one is the bus lane. Again, that would be a peak period bus lane that would accommodate on-street parking and loading during the off-peak periods. You can also see the buffer here, and then the raised unidirectional bikeway, and another buffer that has trees and benches in it. And then here's the sidewalk on this side of the street as well. In terms of the benefits, this option achieves the transit priority objective by implementing a peak period bus lane that would improve transit travel time and reliability. It would also accommodate on-street parking and loading on the east side of the street during the off-peak periods. There will also be space to accommodate enhanced bus stops and make some improvements to the aesthetics of the street. In terms of the drawbacks, this option would not increase the sidewalk width on the east side of the street. This option would also provide the minimum ideal separation between the sidewalk and the bicycle lane. This option would also relocate on-street parking and loading that is currently located on the west side of the street to the east side of the street, which may impact the land uses on the west side of the street. Parking would also not be permitted during the commuting peak periods, and stopping would also not be permitted during that period of time, which could also have impacts on things like tour bus operations during the peak period. And this option will also take away the ability to provide curb extensions or bump outs along Water Street. So again, the transit-focused option would be applied to the majority of the corridor, with the exception of the pinch points at Prince Street and historic properties and the segment between George Street and Duke Street. The second functional design option being considered is option 2, the pedestrian enhanced option. As a reminder, this option prioritizes improvements to the pedestrian realm and public space along the corridor. This slide shows a typical cross-section for the pedestrian enhanced option. And again, I'll describe the diagram from left to right or west to east. For the off-street elements on the west side of the street, this option would include a wide sidewalk and a buffer separating the sidewalk from the roadway. Similar to the transit-focused option, this buffer would provide opportunities to add streetscaping elements like trees, lighting, and benches. For the on-street elements, this option would retain a single traveled lane, and it would include on-street parking and loading on one side of the street. In this option, on-street parking and loading can be strategically allocated to either the east side of the street or the west side of the street, depending on where parking and loading demand is high. This option would also significantly increase the amount of space that is allocated to the off-street design elements on the east side of the street along the majority of the corridor by narrowing the street and reallocating that street space to the pedestrian realm. This option would accommodate a buffer separating the bicycle lane from the roadway. It would also include a raised unidirectional bicycle lane, and it would also include a sidewalk buffer wider than the buffer presented in the transit-focused option. The wider buffer would provide more separation between the sidewalk and the bicycle lane. It would also be able to accommodate more and enhance pedestrian amenities like public art installations and larger public seating. This option also tries to maintain or increase the width of the sidewalk on the east side of the street. So again, I'll stop here for a second as well and just play the video that would show what Water Street could look like with the pedestrian enhanced option. So again, that would be the view along the corridor just north of Morris Street. One other thing that I did not mention yet is that this option would allow us to accommodate curb extensions at the intersections with Water Street. So you can see here that there's just the one travel lane along the corridor, and then curbside access in this example is being shown on the west side of the street along this segment. You can also see the buffer separating the bike lane from the roadway. This is the unidirectional bikeway right here. You can also see that this option includes larger furniture than what we had shown earlier in the transit-focused option. And again, the sidewalk is also a bit it's either maintained as it is today, or it's a bit wider than what it currently is. In terms of the benefits, this option would significantly increase the amount of space allocated to pedestrians. It places a high priority on enhancing the pedestrian realm and making meaningful streetscaping improvements, recognizing the important role that Water Street plays in downtown Halifax as a pedestrian street. This option would increase the separation between the sidewalk and the bicycle lane, reducing the likelihood of pedestrians encroaching on the bicycle lane. This option would also accommodate curb extensions, which would reduce the crossing distance for pedestrians. This option would also provide space for enhanced bus stops, so space for bus shelters as an example. One major drawback to this option, though, is that the transit priority would not be accommodated. This would have an impact on transit travel time and reliability. So again, as part of Transit's Moving Forward Together plan, we're going to expect more routes to run on Water Street during the afternoon peak periods. Again, seeing an increase in the number of buses from 10 today to 37 after those routes start traveling on Water Street. So without transit priority, there will likely be potential impacts on transit's travel time and reliability. In the pedestrian enhanced option, the existing cross section between Prince Street and George Street would be maintained. And then the pedestrian enhanced cross section would be applied to the rest of the corridor, again, with the exception of the pinch points and the segment between George Street and Duke Street. One of the main challenges our project team has faced is trying to prioritize all the design elements on Water Street and balance the needs of all the different users. What we realized through this project is that we can only choose 2 out of the 3 categories to prioritize along the corridor, and that not everything can be a priority on Water Street. We can either get transit priority, make some improvements to the pedestrian realm and public space, but we would lose curbside access where it's needed. Or we can get curbside access where it's needed and make meaningful improvements to the pedestrian realm and public space, but then we would lose transit priority along the majority of the corridor. These are just some of the trade-offs that we've been trying to articulate to the public and stakeholders, just to help us get an understanding of what really is a priority for the corridor. Over the next few slides, I'll go over the proposed streetscaping enhancements as well as the proposed enhanced public spaces. Today, the west side of the street includes sidewalk that is buffered with boxed and raised planters that have trees. These raised planters have decreased the amount of clear space that is available to pedestrians, making it harder for people with mobility difficulties to navigate. As part of this project, we will propose to remove all these raised planters and plant new trees in soil cells. These changes would increase the amount of clear space that is available to pedestrians, making it more comfortable to walk or roll on. In terms of streetscaping, we are considering a modified version of the Downtown Halifax standard for surface materials and furniture selections. And these are being considered for the west side of the street. This is similar to what is currently in front of the Alexander building at Lower Water Street and Bishop Street. On the east side of the street, various surface materials are being considered, including the downtown standard surface materials and materials used on Argyle Street and Spring Garden Road. Various seating options are also being considered, including seating for both individuals and groups. Furniture on this side of the street will feature materials similar to those found on the waterfront, so primarily wood with some metal accents. And some of the proposed furniture palette would again only be applied to the pedestrian enhanced option, as that option would have the ability to accommodate larger furniture for things like group seating, whereas the transit focused option would not. One additional improvement to the east side of the street for both the transit-focused option and the pedestrian-enhanced option is the increase in the number of trees. So today, there are only a few trees in our right-of-way on the east side of the street. And as part of this project, there will be an opportunity there will be opportunities to add trees along the east side, resulting in a net increase in the number of trees along the corridor. There may also be opportunities to expand the public space more extensively in selected locations along Water Street. These public spaces could serve a variety of uses, including enhancing people's experiences, providing locations for public art installation, public seating, and small performing areas to host events like the Halifax Busker Festival. We've identified these locations in our project as enhanced public spaces. One of those enhanced public spaces could be potentially at the corner of Water Street and Salter Street. This planter has caused some accessibility concerns as the sidewalk is located behind the planter and there's no sidewalk along the street. And as part of this project, we're proposing the removal of this planter, and instead we are looking at opportunities to create a public space like a mini plaza or a gathering node. Recognizing that the Salter Street nodes act as a gateway to the waterfront from Spring Garden Road. This is just one example of the proposed enhanced spaces, public spaces along the corridor. In terms of the project schedule, we have recently completed the public and stakeholder engagement phase of the project. We are now in the process of analyzing the feedback that we received and are evaluating the 2 design options in preparation to select an option to recommend to Regional Council for consideration. We're aiming to go to TSC and Regional Council over the summer of this year. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I'm just wondering at this point, if we want time for questions and comments, we're going to run out of time for our third staff presentation. So as Catherine Peck, I'm just wondering, could we perhaps defer that final presentation until our next meeting? Would that be a problem?
Nope, that should not be a problem at all.
Not a problem? Okay, well, that gives us time to make comments and suggestions regarding Lynn's presentation. So let's go through the speaking list. Miles McCormick, do you have comments?
Yeah, thank you very much, Lynn. It's not an easy job that you are working on. In particular, I reflect on time down there trying to balance metro transit with container traffic, tour bus traffic, tourists, bikers, walkers, everything. Thank you very much for what you're doing, and I'm excited to see the final product.
Okay, thank you, Miles. Paul Berry?
Thank you, Hugh. No, nothing to add at this time. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Andrew Taylor?
Excuse me. I am a heavily dependent on transit, so option 1 would be my preference because more buses equals a more active Andrew, which is always a good thing. But that would be my only comment for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Milena?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good to hear you again, Lean. I'm only just going to make one little comment. As I was in the stakeholder meeting on this project already, I really strongly urge that the bike lane that is in front of Queen's Mark is not replicated through the remainder of the Water Street project, because it's a complete mess for all people and bikers that have agreed. And Lean and I have discussed this already. So for the rest of the committee here, it needs to be upgraded and made so that everybody can use it safely. But thanks for the presentation, Lean, and good luck to the team.
Thank you. And maybe just a comment on that is that throughout this project, we are looking at opportunities to improve that buffer space or separation between pedestrians and cyclists so that it's a more, I guess, safer and comfortable experience for both user groups.
Yes, I'm glad that's being heard, as it's quite loathsome for not only bicyclists, but for, everybody using it. And considering that the cruise ships are coming back and over 150 cruise ships are docking this summer on our Water Street, on our so that's going to be continuing on once this project gets going, and you need to have those divisions because people don't watch. Thank you. End of thought.
Thank you, Milena. Elizabeth Pugh.
Oh, nothing from me, thanks.
Okay. Peter Zimmer, are you still here, Peter?
Yes, I am. I wonder, since the whole street is being redeveloped, whether we are looking at the possibility of installing raised pedestrian crosswalks. You seem to indicate this has a tremendous pedestrian flow within there, and some way of maybe automated sensing of when there's pedestrians waiting and giving them an automatic stopping of the traffic so they can go across. I mean, you've seemed to indicate that pedestrians do have a priority. I'd like it be made manifest very physically, very permanently. The other question I've got, my perennial question about the city, is street maintenance in the winter. Where does the snow go? How quickly does it get dealt with? It's kind of a, not street architecture, but it's got to be part of the planning. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. So I would say for things like the raised pedestrians crosswalks, that's something that we could take a closer look at the next phases of the project. So we're still going to have to go through a preliminary design phase and a detailed design phase. And that's something that we could definitely try to take a look at. Usually raised crosswalks are usually harder to implement when there's heavy truck movements and transit movements. So that would be the consideration for Water Street. In terms of the street maintenance and how quickly that can be done, I think at this stage I won't be able to really comment on that. The options that we looked at have been reviewed by our by the road operations and constructions groups, which is the group that deals with the snow removal and snow storage. And our impression is that both options would have adequate space for snow storage and are operationally viable from that perspective. But I can now provide more commentary on that later if needed.
Okay, thank you very much. Douglas Wetmore.
Thank you, Hugh. I apologize to the committee. I'm going to drag this out a little. I've got a handful of questions and comments that I'd like to ask. First of all, regarding the transit routes that you'd mentioned, you said there were 3 routes currently. I'm going to assume that includes the 2?
Yes, that includes the 2.
Oh, okay. I got a little confused there at first. I was only thinking of the 29 and 90. As for the express routes, I've got the moving forward plan open here, and I only see 5 routes going on it. The 5 newly implemented Dartmouth Express routes. Are those, I'm assuming the 130s would also be moved down there? Are those the 10 express routes that would be moved there? Okay.
Yes.
Just wanted to confirm that.
Yeah, so they're I think running on Barrington Street today, and the plan as part of the moving forward together plan would be to bring them down to Water Street.
Okay, just wanted to make sure I understood that first.
Yeah.
So I've used Water Street personally for pretty much all 4 different methods. I've used it for transit quite regularly, walking, as a cyclist, and in a private vehicle. And as it stands right now, pretty much all 4 methods are miserable. So transit it's a drag getting caught in transit. More often than not, it'd just be faster to cycle down. As a cyclist, I'm going to echo what Milena said. As a cyclist, it's equally awful to cycle down that raised bikeway. It'd be much better if it was kind of on ground, similar to South Park Street. And I know you had mentioned what the proper buffer would be between to kind of help separate the pedestrians and cyclists. But even looking at South Park Street between Sackville and Spring Garden Road right now, because I know that one's raised and there's a very wide buffer. And I'll give it credit, it's not as bad as Water Street currently, but it's still not ideal. There's a lot of traffic that kind of conflicts on those raised bikeways. So if there's anything that can be done to bring those down on the road, I think that would be the preferred option there. Looking at the 2 options overall, I personally wasn't really a fan of either, but I know given the restrictions, there's got to be some sort of give and take. I did the survey, I was reading the report before. My preferred option would be option 2, just because my vision for Water Street, Lower Water Street, it would essentially become an extension of the boardwalk, a very heavily pedestrian oriented area, less of a street and more of a destination. I know this really isn't feasible, but I'm going to bring it up anyways, is what would be really ideal was if we could get the eventual Spring Garden Road treatment where during peak hours, it was transit only access, or if there was any way that we could reduce the amount of non-transit oriented vehicles, maybe even looking at banning private cars and only allowing necessary truck and transit travel. I feel like that would be the best option paired with design option 2. I could speak for hours, but for the sake of the committee, I will cut it there. Thank you very much for presenting.
Thank you, Douglas. Yes, we are running out of time. So Becky Kent, do you have comments?
No, Hugh, I'll leave mine for another opportunity with council. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I have a brief comment myself. This is a designated truck route, and that is a large part of the problem with the traffic holdups on that street much of the day. For that reason, if it's going to continue as a truck route, I think option 1 has to be the one to go with, because by segregating buses at peak periods from other traffic, you at least give both types of traffic more speed. Frankly, the real solution is to have a different designated truck route. And one option, of course, is to put trucks maybe on trains going through the CN rail route. But
so maybe
as things stand, sorry.
If I may provide a response to the truck route comment.
Yeah.
So while we may not be able to get rid of all the trucks along Water Street, the Halifax Port Authority is working on reducing port-related truck traffic along the corridor, which will likely see a reduction in their traffic by about 2/3 or 75% of their trucks volume going down.
That would be great. I'd be interested to know how they're going to do that. But
yeah, I think they're moving. I think they're working on a rail cut project,
Yes,
and some of
yeah.
those goods will be moved that way instead of by truck.
Yeah, that's been an idea. It's been floating around for a long time. Yeah. Okay, I think we have to leave it there. We are out of time anyway, but I do have to just skip forward here. Our date of next meeting is May the 19th. So please note that in your calendars, and we will expect to see the deferred item at that meeting. So with that, item 11 is adjournment. And I need a motion to adjourn with no seconder required. Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you next month. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Everyone, thank you, Lean and Hannah. Take
Have
care.
a good evening.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.